There was a time when Buffalo looked like one of America's cities of the future. Money was pouring into its streets, factories were running, and its waterfront was moving enormous amounts of goods. But today, parts of that same city stand strangely quiet.
So, what happened to the place that once seemed impossible to stop? Buffalo's story began much smaller. In the early 1800s, it was little more than a settlement beside Lake Erie. Then, in 1825, the Erie Canal changed everything.
It connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, creating a new path for grain, goods, and people moving across America. Suddenly, Buffalo was sitting at one of the most important crossroads in the country. Grain arrived from the growing American interior, and Buffalo became the place where it was stored, transferred, and shipped east.
But there was a problem. Workers had to unload enormous amounts of grain by hand. Then came a remarkable invention: the grain elevator. What once took workers days could now be done in hours. Buffalo didn't just handle the nation's grain, it learned how to move it faster. And the money followed. Railroads expanded, steel mills appeared, factories grew, banks and businesses multiplied. Grand mansions rose along Delaware Avenue, while impressive buildings transformed downtown. Then, another revolution arrived from nearby Niagara Falls.
Electricity. Buffalo was becoming a symbol of American progress. By the early 1900s, the city had enormous wealth, ambitious architecture, powerful industries, and a growing population. For a moment, it seemed like Buffalo's future could only become bigger. But hidden inside its greatest strength was a weakness. Buffalo depended heavily on its location. Then, in 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway opened a new route connecting the Great Lakes and the Atlantic.
Ships could now bypass Buffalo. And slowly, the city's advantage began to disappear. The change was not immediate. First, shipping declined. Then, industries struggled. Factories reduced their workforce. Jobs disappeared. And eventually, people began leaving for places where the new opportunities were.
Buffalo's population fell dramatically. Some of its greatest buildings were abandoned. Its enormous grain elevators became strangely silent. The central terminal, once designed for thousands of passengers, eventually stood almost empty. Yet Buffalo never completely disappeared. Today, its old buildings, waterfront, and massive grain elevators still remain, quiet reminders of a city that once stood at the center of American industry. And perhaps that is what makes Buffalo so fascinating. Because when you walk through this city today, you aren't simply exploring a place. You are exploring the remains of a dream that once seemed impossible to fail. Sometimes, the most fascinating cities aren't the ones that never fell, but the ones that still remember how high they once